You're good.
Alright. So, up until now, it's been primary colors, but I mixed that 2-color black, which is kind of a gray at this wash, or with this much water in it. It's Perylene Maroon with phthalo green blue shade, and it's like 5 Perylene Maroon to 1 phthalo green. It makes a nice gray 2-color mixture, which is really important for watercolor because actual black colors have really heavy pigments like the iron oxide blacks and lamp blacks and stuff, and they are not as transparent, and a lot of times with some of them there's, ooh, that's gross, there's granulation, and that's not what I'm looking for. So there we go. I've been talking this 2-color black up for a while, and here it is. And so the first thing I was going to talk about, first thing I was going to talk about was, I guess, a couple people specifically, but more broadly, I guess it's like the post-Daily Show, or post-Jon Stewart, media environment, or whatever, just all the Jon Stewart copycat shows, and so the first thing is I would like to say that, so there's definitely a difference. I notice a difference in how these newer versions of The Daily Show, or like the Samantha Bee Show, or the John Oliver Show, it seems like Jon Stewart was more often than not pretty skeptical of official lines and had a reasonably cynical view of politics, and the newer shows feel like propaganda, and the John Oliver Show in particular, the jokes are extremely formulaic, and it's all exposition about issues, and I think a lot of it does bring attention to important issues, but it's also sort of a it makes certain things cause celebs, and then certain things that he didn't happen to focus on less visible. And it's not that I mind this kind of show. Rachel Maddow does a pretty good job doing a similar thing, just trying to talk about things that she thinks are important, that happened in the news or happening around the world, or have to do with politics. The thing with the John Oliver Show, I suppose humor is subjective, but the jokes he makes are very easy jokes. They're usually based on appearance, or they just talk about a cat meme, or they make a reference, and it tain't the same on that dimension, but I suppose that is pretty subjective. I've seen more John Oliver than either of the other two shows. Trevor Noah is the new host of The Daily Show, and he's terrible. It just comes off as full-on propaganda, and it's supposed to be a comedy show. The way that they intentionally oversimplify issues, and they don't really make jokes, and so many of the jokes are just at the expense of people's physical appearances, or about basically their differences, and not so much about the horrible things they might be doing to the country. And Yeah, and then another thing about Trevor Noah as a comedian, like he fake laughs at his jokes as he's delivering them, and it's really unpleasant to witness. And then the other thing is, it's like, why did this dude get the job? Like, were there not other comedians that were associated with The Daily Show that would have been, like, have a track record of being funny in the same sort of way? And I guess specifically what I want to ask is, why do we need to import comedians to talk about really important political issues in a venue that's been understood to be politically influential in the past? And so it just seems like that's so... I mean, it's just, he is a mouthpiece of the writers, and the writers increasingly seem to be taking, like, direct... like, they seem to be more directly trying to affect the politics, whereas Jon Stewart was often just trying to have a conversation. And I think that the Daily Show has turned into part of an echo chamber that isn't helpful to the discussion. And I think a lot of comedy right now is really mean-spirited. It's and misdirected. It's not that Donald Trump has small hands. Like, that's not why he's an abhorrent human being. It's because he's demonstrably a horrible solipsist and a misogynist, like, amongst other things. He seems to go out of his way to make people miserable that he feels like have slighted him. There's a lot of reasons, and it just seems like, instead of making easy jokes about his mannerisms or appearance or whatever, you could exposit those things if that's really your concern. So, yeah, that's all. I mean, I don't watch a lot of television these days. A lot of it just the internet. Google asks me to watch it, and then they demand that I watch it when I politely refuse. And I've noticed a lot with the Colbert Report as well, and it's just this trend of people getting their news from comedians who are disconnected from the politics and whose job it is to continue making money and off of our dysfunctional politics. And these shows are popular because our politics are dysfunctional, and so what is their incentive to make the politics more functional? And I don't think that there is one. And so I just don't think that... What is your reason to expect Trevor Noah is a good Democrat who is concerned about the polity and is concerned about a country he's not from? Like, and you're putting him in basically a propagandist role, and ain't nothing wrong with propaganda, but it can be delivered honestly, and it just seems like you could get somebody more akin to Jon Stewart, who has a more realistic, learned approach to American politics, but I think who's like Jon Stewart, I guess. The Colbert Report stuff was pretty rough because it's just he's like Jay Leno, but he attacks. He's like Jay Leno with a less varied, like, purview of things to talk about. And so here's the thing: is I do think that Donald Trump is terrible, but again, there's specifics to how he's terrible, and if that is really what you want to do, it seems like you should just talk more about the specifics, and you should try to build a continuous, credible case, and just saying, yeah, you hate him, we hate him, like, problem solved. And it's very difficult, I think, when you have a president like Donald Trump to think about how much time you should invest to thinking about him as a person rather than thinking about the effects of the policies that he is or isn't enforcing, and the more long-term effects of his presidency. And yeah, he is a really, really dislikable person, and I think that right now that is just, I mean, CNN helped him get elected and then apologized and then continued to do the same thing with, and it's true that you do have to cover the President of the United States, but the way every news story turns into being about Donald Trump, and the way very like strange aspects of his responses are the ones that get focused on, and yeah, I guess that's about it for that. I slept about 3 hours last night, so I'm probably even more coherent than normal. Well, this looks kind of sloppy. I think I could, this is tough, and try to make this line a little bit, a little bit crisper. And so yeah, it's not that I don't appreciate social commentary, and in a humorous form in particular. I did like The Daily Show when Jon Stewart was the captain. I didn't actively watch it every day, but I do think that, like, for instance, South Park has an episode on almost every interesting, like, American phenomena that's happened while it's been on air, and some stuff that happened, like, before, and the way it talks about these things is really pretty unique as far as the approach they often take and sort of the absurdist view they take on stuff, and how it's just pretty clear they're not afraid to be they don't really care if people misconstrue or their actions or say that they are like horrible people or whatever, because it's going to happen because they've been hearing it since they started the show. And yeah, so I think it can be done well, and I mean that's an anime, but it's just sort of, are you concerned about the Donald Trump presidency as a political issue, and if so, sort of take it seriously, and if don't watch people whose job is to make a show out of it, to get your information about it. And also, what kind of information do you think you need going forward, and what are the things that are the most important? So, like the policies that he could pass, and what could you do about it? What can you do about it in advance? I think the thing for me is that I don't think, like, I mean, I vote, so I sort of think that you can't, he got voted in how our laws work, and you sort of can't penalize him for not winning opinion polls because he won the Electoral College. So yeah, this is dried off a bit. So yeah, sorry about that quick cutoff, but the basic thing is, I don't think it's democratic for me actively to try to impair the functioning of his presidency, because other people elected him as president. and he won he played by the rules that are set in the Constitution, and it's what you can't. I mean, yeah, you can't. It seems like you have to have way worse stuff, much more organized stuff than just the sort of chaos and ineptitude we're seeing going on before you can, like, immediately say that. I mean, and the Electoral College isn't super fair from a popular vote perspective, but it was set up so that the popular vote didn't win the presidency. I mean, it was set up so that the states, it was weighted towards the states because of, like, sort of the federalism discussion around the time the Declaration was written and the Bill of Rights was written afterwards. And so, yeah, it's really rough to see somebody that you don't like as president that seems to be just messing it up every day and just making things worse and ignoring the only issue that matters. But we live in a democracy, and, well, sort of. And so that's the thing, is we never lived in an advertised democracy, and this isn't like a throwaway argument. This is, I mean, the founding fathers promised that they didn't deliver a democracy. Monroe in particular, because they didn't want it, because the United States was set up by property owners that didn't like a class system and wanted people to be able to have secure property rights and not have some arbitrary ruler take their property from them. And that's it. Look at the founding fathers. Look at how much this stuff they owned. Not all of them did. But Ben Franklin was a enterprising son of a gun. This gray is looking a little bit more maroon than green. The mix is off a little bit, but it's going to even out as it goes down. This paper isn't... It still sort of buckles a lot when it pulls up water, or when it gets too wet. And like I said, I haven't really had as much of that happen with other 300-pound paper I've used. And this is, again, Legion 300-pound cold press. Yeah. The next thing I wanted to talk about was, and this is sort of based on a conversation I recently had with a colleague at the Reel to Reel warehouse, is I'm just, like, noticing a growing attitude on both the... It's like the right-left thing, but I suppose the far right, maybe the internet right and the internet left. I've just seen a growing trend of anti-Semitism, and the anti-Semitism on the right seems to be pretty historic, like anti-Semitism, like New World Government, like Zionist World Government stuff. And then the stuff on the left seems, I mean, is all directly related to the Palestine-Israel conflict, but it's gotten to the point where people call people Zionists just because they say that they believe Israel as a state has a right to exist. And yeah, and so I sort of wanted to talk about my understanding of the historical context of anti-Semitism as it relates to Europe and as it relates to America. Europe has historically had a lot of trouble with anti-Semitism. Pogroms, like, happened all the time, and which, I mean, means that they would raise villages and they would kill people en masse, or they would imprison them, or they would force them to overtly stop practicing, and all sorts of really horrible stuff. And that happened pretty consistently because Jews were a visible minority, because they acted differently, and because they weren't Christians. And while we certainly got some of the old anti-Semitism, in America, we seem, at least in the 20th century, it seems like we managed to ditch a lot of it, especially after World War II, and we sort of have the, I mean, it is an issue, but it's less of an issue, or it has been less of an issue, and now it seems like, I mean, it's absurd to me to, like, the people that were kicked out of the Dyke March because they had a Star of David on their pride flag and stuff like that. It's just super divisive, and besides that, it's just like, Jews make all the best stuff. I mean, they get disproportionate amounts of Nobel Prizes. So just talking about the 20th century, like, America rode to world prominence because our cities, and in particular New York City, was a good, safe place for Jewish people to move and raise their families for decades and decades. And so you have all of these really prolific, talented artists and composers and writers and journalists and stuff in disproportionate amounts coming from Jewish communities. And I mean, you can look at Nobel Prizes, you can look at, it's just like cartooning. So many early cartoonists, I mean, Will Eisner, but I think the guy that made Superman was Jewish, and it's just like there's so many cartoonists, like Art Spiegelman, so many cartoonists have been Jewish, and so many composers, and like people who write musicals, and like musical theater was a huge art form in the previous century. It's still, I mean, it still happens, but it's definitely not the living art that it the living developing art that it was. And although people could argue with me on that, and I'd be happy to have that conversation. Sounds like an interesting conversation, but yeah, I mean, that's the thing, is it's really troubling to see any anti-Semitism in particular, and to see it so strongly connected with politics right now, and on the left, it seems preposterous. And when you factor in the Israel-Palestine issue, you can see where it comes from, but it doesn't make it any more acceptable. Yeah, and that's about that. Is it was just, it's a thing I've noticed more and more on the internet, and the person I was talking to had certainly noticed it. And yeah, it's not a place, you don't want to be in a society that doesn't tolerate Jews. It's a pretty clear way of letting you know you're off track. And minorities in general, that doesn't tolerate minorities in general. But yeah, so I suppose what I'm trying to say is that you don't spread tolerance or understanding by stereotyping people and being intolerant to them, and being intolerant also to their alternate views. Yeah, so I'm mixing up some magenta. Oop, I'm getting it all over the place. This is going to be a pretty light wash. Sam Harris had a podcast recently where he talks about Charlottesville, and that was really great. I would recommend it. It was with, oh gosh, Douglas Murray. And yeah, I think that he's the first person I saw talking, and I think I expressed this in an earlier video, just how disturbing everyone's reaction to it has been, and he talked about specifics, like where Donald Trump says there was extremism on both sides, and people attacked that, and there was extremism on both sides, and that doesn't mean, and yeah, the thing he says, which is that all identity politics are horrible, but white identity politics are especially horrible. Like, I think that's true, and I think that the reasoning he gives in that podcast is really good, and I'm not really going to parrot it more than I already parrot Sam Harris, I'm sure. And yeah, I mean, that's sort of the... It was really disturbing to me locally when the takeaways I was getting from people, and just the willingness of people to typecast every single person in that group as a Nazi. And also, just if you call everybody a Nazi, I mean, it's sort of the boy who cried wolf, but also, how are you gonna get anything done if one side calls the other side Nazis and fascists, and the other side calls the other side fascists and communists? And it's just like, the only way this can work is if we talk through it. There's no way that armed conflict is going to lead to a satisfactory answer to this, and there's definitely, like, or street fighting, or fighting at protests, or anything like that. We need to use the democratic institutions we have, and we need to strengthen the democratic institutions we have so that our democracy can survive the next century, and so that it can be more responsive, and it can deal with climate change, which is, I think, for a lot of people, it's for a lot of young people, it's the biggest issue, and for a lot of people, or for some people, I should say, ooh, wow, I got a piece of pigment and it sort of went crazy. For some people, it's the only issue. And right now we have a president who pretends it's not real, which is pretty rough. And yeah, what does it do? I mean, Donald Trump must represent a constitutional crisis. Like, what else could? The fact that somebody that is so widely unpopular wins the presidency and passes widely unpopular... I mean, the bills that Republicans pass in general are widely unpopular, and, like, because of gerrymandering, they have permanent or semi-permanent control in areas that they wouldn't otherwise, and, like, that's not made up. Gerrymandering is a real, studied, understood phenomena. Like, you can look at some of the maps they cut up, and they're extreme and obvious. Some of them they rework to make less obvious, some of them they don't have to. It depends on the state. And yeah, so that's sort of your whole deal, is you can be critical of the system and be critical of the democratic institutions, and there are many, many, many weaknesses and anti-democratic tendencies, and you can still want to uphold those institutions and strengthen them and make them better. And I think that if you care about those institutions, you should always be concerned about trying to strengthen them and make them better. Yeah. Well, those flowers are looking pretty nice. Go on here. So yeah, I have a feeling that this branch is going to look weird. It's a brown in my reference image, and yeah, I've been trying to layer, and now I'm adding more magenta, and I think eventually I'll add more of that black, but I would like to try to get that brown. And generally brown is a lot of yellow with less magenta, and then sometimes a tiny amount of blue. In the past I've looked up CMYK printer codes, like hex codes and stuff, and I found those to be pretty accurate for mixing colors from pure pigments, or at least to give you pretty decent guides for mixing colors from pure pigments. Yeah, cool. Well, I think I'm gonna dry this off. Some of this ragged edge is sort of, a lot of this is the cold press. It would look pretty different in hot press. Yeah, it's going to be hard for me to figure out when to stop, because it's never going to look good. And it doesn't, I don't know if the paper is going to hold built-up paint as well as hot press does, because it's not really the same thing. Although the biggest difference is the texture and the amount of sizing. I don't know if the amount of sizing is different for Stonehenge, but I know it is for some other manufacturers. There's some yellow before we do anything else. Yeah, so I'm gonna throw some more yellow on there, and then I'm gonna dry it out and talk about a different thing. So earlier I had a sort of explosion of pigment on one of these flowers, this one, and I just wanted to take the opportunity to talk about why that happened. It's because I'm a slob and I leave my paint uncovered, it gets dust in it, and it affects how it re-wets. And yeah, don't do it. Do as I say, not as I do. And that's the interesting thing about watercolors. That's a lot. And working with paper in general, is a lot of it is learning how not to destroy the paper, and how to take care of the paints, and how to take care of whatever, your medium substrate, I guess, ultimately. Yeah, and so I think I'm going to go back on the old gray matter. I wanted to talk about animation, and that's because I think animation is a really good argument for human civilization, and I think it's about the most interesting thing we've made as a species, and it's this huge collaborative art project that tells a story, and when it's done right, it's just really, really great. And I'm talking specifically about, I suppose, traditional animation, but I guess I'll talk about, yeah, and we never really had the industry for it, like Japan did, and like evidently France did. We have had like Saturday morning cartoons and stuff like that, but the quality of animation for a lot of our features that weren't Disney features, next to like Studio Ghibli or other stuff coming out in the 80s, or other stuff coming out in Japan sort of in general, yeah, and that's because it's really difficult to set up an animation studio and to run an animation studio, and it requires lots of people with lots of different skills. It requires a director who really knows what's up and who has a strong vision, and then everyone needs to work under that director. And so I think Japan's sort of how they organize themselves in the workforce, I think, was conducive to that, and that's part of why Japanese animation is such a high quality. I think, well, it was because of the thriving post-industrial society, but also I think people work together well, and that's really stressed by the society. And I've heard a lot of people say it's stressed too much by the society, and that's pretty interesting too. It is Japan is a rough place to be, from what I've heard, and it seems pretty reliable. It's a pretty rough place to be somebody who like goes against the grain or is a strong individualist or whatever. And yeah, we sort of encourage it in America, and we consider it like a huge virtue, but yeah, I mean, I can't go too much into depth about it because I don't know too much about it, but there's definitely cultural differences you pick up on when you watch products of both cultures, and there's a lot. I mean, Studio Ghibli in particular retains, like, oh, goosh. I don't know what I was going to say there. Tira's asleep. But I don't so much like 3D animation because I think it's different, and because I think it is. I mean, I guess a part of it is I just don't enjoy it as much. That it doesn't seem as effortful. It doesn't seem as intentional. You're sort of building a 3D model and then you're moving it around. And the thing that's really appealing about animation is every single shot is perfect. Every shot is exactly. It's drawn exactly as. Well, unless they couldn't do it, but it's drawn exactly as the director wanted to see it, and there's not really considerations of framing a shot. You can sort of build. Yeah, I mean, there is considerations of framing a shot, I should say, but you're not moving around assets in a 3D environment and then taking a picture with a 3D camera. Some exceptions for 3D. There's definitely 3D animation I like, and there's definitely good 3D animation. It's just traditional animation in particular I think is really culturally valuable, and we should make an effort as a species to make more of it and to keep the industry alive, or I suppose reinvigorate a dead or dying industry. Yeah. Well, that's looking pretty good. I think that's my gray layers for now. I think I'm going to throw down some more yellow. Yeah, and there's other instances of, art done on large scale that I think is really. I mentioned musicals, opera, stuff like that, and I mean, I think art on every scale is valuable. It's just that animation is in a lot of ways, when it's done really right, it's just really sort of universally impressive. And that's sort of what you're trying to do with art. This is interesting. Sort of how I've messed this up related to the reference, although it's pretty far from the reference. But yeah, so I did notice that the M-gram dried a little bit differently. I mentioned that I was using the M-gram yellow now, just to see how different it is, and it does dry a little bit differently. But it isn't a bad thing. It re-wet easily. I don't know if I noticed a difference between Winsor Newton, but I'd like to think I did. Or at least I think I did. I think it was a little bit easier to re-wet than the other stuff. But yeah, it's all pretty nice paint. I have been losing bristles on this brush, so I might need to pick up another one of these brushes. Yeah, and so I guess the last thing I want to talk about was just listening to what other people have to say, and I think we need to get rid of guilt by association, and I think everyone needs to talk to as many people with opposing viewpoints as they can, without, driving down to KKK meetings to try to talk to KKK people. You don't need to go whole hog, but it's like if someone says something you disagree with, like actually talk to them about the substance and let them get to know you, and odds are they probably won't hate you, and odds are you can actually probably have a constructive conversation. If you're making a lot of visible effort, even if they have trouble with it, a lot of times they'll pull through, and you'll be really glad you did it. I think social media is not helpful for political regeneration. I think if you're really concerned about being a responsible Democrat, which is to say a person concerned with democracy, then you should seriously consider how much influence you let social media have over you and how much time you spend on it. Because ultimately your feed is controlled by an algorithm which is trying to capitalize on your time and make as much money off of your time as possible. Oops. Actually, that's not bad. Let's smudge that up a bit. It's kind of... Yeah, it's like I did it on purpose. Yeah. Can I get any more? Also, this probably isn't good, this whole touching the paper thing. But I haven't had too much trouble with it. Yeah. Kristofferson's debut album is great. I don't know if you've heard Kris Kristofferson's debut album. It's called Kris Kristofferson. Can't miss it. It's fantastic. I got it at a local retailer for, I think, under $10 in shrink wrap, so they must be re-releasing it. And it's just a great album. The song To Beat the Devil is just like a fantastic song about sort of songwriting and the futility of songwriting. There's a song called Laws Are for the Protection of the People, which is just really fantastic, and it's about sort of, a lot of it's about arbitrary laws, and yeah, it's really, he has a song that says facetiously, blame it on the Stones, which is to say the Rolling Stones, and he talks about a lot of disconnected problems that obviously have nothing to do with the Rolling Stones and traces them back to the Rolling Stones. And so it's really interesting to see an atypical point of view from the time that was coming from that kind of the more rural or like country music perspective or whatever. I really like a lot of songs on that album, and if you like country music and you haven't listened to that album, I would really suggest it. I think it has the highest density of his best songs, and part of that's probably because he spent 4 or 5 years trying to get it made, which he eventually did, obviously. And yeah, this is looking pretty good. So, because of the aforementioned sleep deprivation, I think that I'm going to end this one a little bit early. I hope I wasn't too incoherent. The big thing is, we're humans with language and words. We can be careful about our language, and we can talk to each other in ways that we can better refine our ideas. And, yeah, I think there's a lot of discussions that need to be had about how democratic certain institutions are, how we can make certain institutions more democratic, how we can democratically secure certain things that I think a lot of the country sees as essential freedoms. I'm talking specifically about a woman's right to an abortion, a safe abortion, and I think that the people on the pro-choice side need to really go on an offensive as far as promoting this policy, because who knows how long Roe v. Wade's going to last, and if you actually get it into the Constitution, or you build a campaign and you start the footwork now, I think that it's going to be a necessity. And I think it's very important to an advanced democracy to give women control over their reproductive health. And then one thing towards that is I think people need to, on whatever sort of bitter, like, two-sided debate you're talking about, like yes or no, like a lot of moral issues or whatever, I think people need to talk to decide on mutually acceptable terminology and call themselves by that. So I don't know why pro-choice people can't. I don't know. I wouldn't be ashamed to say that I am as a shorthand to say pro-abortion, because you are saying that you think that it should be, because the anti-abortion stance is that it's basically never acceptable. And so, yeah, and I guess maybe it's impossible, and everyone will always call each other names on the other side, but I just don't think that has to be the case. And I think that this has been used for too long to divide American politics, and that this discussion can really be had, and that a lot of people just aren't trying because they already think they're right. And you have to be willing to be convinced the other way if the evidence is good enough, and if your evidence is good enough, then it will hold, and you'll retain your position. And I think the evidence is very, very good that access to the contraceptives and abortion specifically is good for Western democracy. Yeah, and that would be... I've never really had an in-depth conversation with a person that holds the opposing viewpoint to me on this issue, and I would be really interested to, and I think that we would both learn, and I would get better at my ability to persuade people away from that position. I mean, and you will too. If you talk to people about it, eventually, I mean, you do end up persuading people. It just doesn't happen right away, but if it's a person you see a lot and it's something you talk about and you have non-contentious, friendly discussions about it, I think you'd be really surprised at how people can change their minds. Yeah, so I think that's about it. Yeah, this is really something, isn't it? I don't think this is even going to make Grandma happy. Some things I'm not really happy with are these harsh, like I said, these harsh sort of feathering lines that I wouldn't be getting with, and that's the thing. Don't do this with cold press. But I wanted to start it out with cold press. I wanted to try out the free sample. I had an understanding that this particular flower painting, and since it's also going to be the first chunk of videos, that the paint is going to be a little rough, the videos are going to be a little rough as I figure out what I'm doing, and so I didn't think it was too much of an issue. In a million years, when I finish these flowers, I'll be excited to pick out what flower I'll paint next. Right now the leading contender is there's these flowers that look like naked dudes with dongs. And they grow in Spain, I think. They're pretty common, and they're hilarious to look at because they look like little elf dudes, often with dongs. So yeah, look at these flowers, look up those flowers, and we'll catch you on the flip side.